The moment I told 4,000 alien civilizations that humanity was declaring war on every single one of them, the silence in the Concorde chamber was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat through my suit jacket. Not a whisper, not a breath, just the low electrical hum of the translation grid and the sound of my pulse hammering against my ribs. My name is Dominic Hale, and 3 seconds ago, I was nobody, a provisional diplomat from a provisional planet, standing at a podium made of polished stone that was older than human agriculture. Now, I was the man who had just set the galaxy on fire. Let me back up. Not far. Just 20 minutes. That is how long it took for everything to change. The Concorde assembly chamber was a dome the size of a small city, carved into the interior of an orbital station called the Pinnacle. Rows of floating platforms rose in concentric rings from the central floor, each one holding a delegation from one of the 4,312 member species of the Galactic Concorde. Every shape you could imagine sat in those seats. Beings with too many legs, beings with no legs at all, beings that looked like glass sculptures filled with light, and beings that looked like something you would find at the bottom of an ocean trench. The air smelled like copper and lavender, and something sharp I had never been able to identify. I had been Earth's ambassador to this place for 3 years, 3 years of polite introductions that went nowhere, 3 years of submitting proposals that were tabled, postponed, or quietly deleted from the record, 3 years of being patted on the head by species that had been building starships while humans were still figuring out bronze. But today was different. Today, the Concorde was not ignoring us. Today, they were paying very close attention. High Arbiter Zelquan Drath stood at the central platform, his tall, angular body draped in the deep violet robes of his office. Drath was Veloci, one of the founding species of the Concorde. The Veloci looked vaguely humanoid if you squinted, but taller, thinner, with skin the color of ash, and eyes like polished amber. They had ruled the Concorde in all but name for centuries, and Drath was their sharpest blade. He was reading Resolution 7701 aloud. I stood at the respondent's podium 30 meters away and listened to every word. The species designated as human, originating from the Class 7 death world known as Earth, has demonstrated behavioral and developmental patterns inconsistent with the safety requirements of galactic civilization, Drath said, his translated voice smooth and cold. Their documented traits include, but are not limited to, apex predatory instincts, pack-bonding aggression, environmental hyperadaptability, pursuit endurance beyond any recorded species, and a rate of technological acceleration that exceeds all established developmental models by a factor of 11. Factor of 11. I almost smiled at that. We had gone from wooden sailing ships to faster-than-light travel in less than 400 years. Most species took 4,000. The Veloci themselves had taken 6,000, and they had never forgiven us for it. Therefore, Drath continued, this body moves to enact a provisional quarantine of the Sol system, effective immediately. A sensor perimeter and interdiction fleet will be established at a radius of 2 light-years from the human homeworld. No human vessel will be permitted to cross this boundary without explicit Concorde authorization. This measure is enacted for the protection of all member species. Protection. That was the word they chose. Not punishment. Not imprisonment. Protection. As if locking 8 billion people inside their own solar system was an act of kindness. The vote had already happened, of course. It was conducted the previous night in a closed session I was not invited to. The result was on Drath's screen, and he read it with the calm satisfaction of a man who had already won. The vote stands at 4,311 in favor, 1 abstention. Drath looked at me. The abstention being the human delegation, which was not eligible to vote on matters concerning its own status. 4,311 to 0. Every single species in the Concorde had voted to cage us. I looked across the chamber at the delegations I had spent 3 years cultivating. The Brelikai trade envoys who had shared meals with me and told me about their children. They voted yes. The Ofari science liaisons who had marveled at human music and asked me to send them recordings of orchestras. They voted yes. The Keth Combine, a coalition of 40 smaller species, who I had thought understood what it meant to be overlooked by the powerful. They voted yes too. Every single one of them. My aide, Elena Voss, stood behind me at the edge of the platform. I could feel her tension without looking. She was 28, brilliant, and she had spent 2 years helping me draft proposals that no one ever read. She knew what was coming, because I had told her that morning. She also knew that what I was about to do would either save humanity or end both our careers in the most spectacular way possible. The human delegation is now granted a courtesy response period of 5 minutes, Drath said. He gestured toward me with one long, gray hand. Ambassador Hale, you may address the chamber. A courtesy response. 5 minutes to accept the death sentence of human expansion. 5 minutes to bow, scrape, and thank them for the cage. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the small communication device there. It was already warm, the quantum link to Earth active and waiting. I pressed the single button on its surface. In Geneva, 7,000 light-years away, Director Catherine Marsh of the United Earth Council would be receiving a one-word message, confirmed. 3 seconds passed. The device vibrated once in my palm. Authorization granted. I straightened my tie. I looked at Drath. I looked at the 4,000 assembled delegations stretching up into the darkness above me. And then I opened the folder on my podium, the one I had prepared 6 months ago for this exact moment. High Arbiter Drath, I said. Distinguished delegates, I have reviewed Resolution 7701 in its entirety. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Good. The translation grid carried it across the chamber in 4,000 languages simultaneously. I understand the concerns expressed within it, I continued. I understand that many species find humanity's development alarming. I understand the desire for safety, for predictability, for control. I paused. The chamber was still. They expected surrender. They expected the Deathworld monkey to fold. However, I said, I am not here to accept this resolution. A murmur rippled through the lower tiers. Drath's amber eyes narrowed. Instead, I said, acting under the full authority of the United Earth Council, and in accordance with the rights granted to all sovereign species under the Concord Founding Charter, I hereby issue the following declaration. I picked up the document. My hands were not shaking. I would not let them shake. As of this moment, the human species formally declares a state of war against every member species of the Galactic Concord, individually and collectively, without exception, without reservation, and without time limitation. Silence. Perfect, crystalline silence. For about 2 seconds. Then the chamber erupted. Screams in languages I did not recognize tore through the air. Delegates leaped from their platforms. Some ran for the exits. Others pressed against the railings, shouting down at me with fury or terror or both. Security drones dropped from ceiling ports, their blue scanning beams sweeping the room. Armed Veloci guards materialized from side passages, their weapons drawn but pointed at nothing in particular, because no one knew what to do. I stood at the podium and waited. Drath slammed his palm against the control surface of his platform, and a low, resonant tone rolled through the chamber, cutting through the noise. It took almost a full minute for the chaos to subside enough for him to speak. Ambassador Hale, Drath said, and for the first time in 3 years, I heard something other than condescension in his voice. I heard uncertainty. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious, High Arbiter, I said. The declaration has been filed with the Concord's central record system. You should be receiving the formal documentation on your terminal now. Drath glanced down. His expression told me everything I needed to know. The filing had gone through. My legal team had submitted it through proper channels at the exact moment I spoke the words, time-stamped and authenticated. This is insanity, Drath said. You are a single species. 1 planet. 8 billion individuals. You cannot wage war on a galactic civilization. I agree, I said. Which brings me to the reason for this declaration. I tapped my podium screen and projected a section of the Concord Founding Charter onto the chamber's central display, a holographic text field 50 meters wide hanging in the air above us. Article 9, Section 14 of the Founding Charter, I said. I will read the relevant passage. In the event that a formal state of war is declared between any member species and the Concord body, all pending resolutions affecting the declaring species, shall be suspended immediately, and shall remain suspended until such time as the conflict is resolved through formal treaty negotiation. The chamber went quiet again. A different kind of quiet, the kind that comes when the ground shifts under your feet, and you suddenly realize you are not standing where you thought you were. Resolution 7701 is a pending resolution, I said. It has been passed, but not yet enacted. As of my declaration, it is now suspended. Earth retains full sovereign mobility. No quarantine, no censor net, no interdiction fleet, not until this war is formally resolved. I closed the folder. I did not come here to beg, I said. I came here to negotiate. And now, for the first time in 3 years, you have a reason to listen. I stepped back from the podium. Elena was staring at me with wide eyes, but there was a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. She knew. She had helped me find that clause. Drath stared at me from across the chamber floor. The holographic text of Article 9 still glowed above us. His amber eyes moved from the text to me and back again. "You have gone mad," he whispered. The translation grid carried it to every ear in the room. I held his gaze and kept my voice even. "No, High Arbiter. I just read your own laws better than you did." The session was suspended. Guards escorted me back to the human embassy wing, and as the heavy doors closed behind me, I allowed myself one long, slow breath. The declaration of war had been filed, the quarantine was frozen, and in approximately 6 hours, every species in the Galactic Concord would begin to understand that the small, loud, reckless Deathworld species they had tried to cage had just turned their own legal framework into a weapon. This was not insanity. This was the plan. And it was only the beginning. The guards who escorted me back to the embassy wing did not speak. They were Velocci, tall and silent in their dark armor, and they positioned themselves outside my door like statues the moment I stepped inside. No one called it house arrest. No one used those words. But when Elena tried to step out an hour later to retrieve a datapad she had left in the auxiliary hall, they told her the corridor was restricted for security purposes, and she came back with her jaw tight and her fists clenched. "So that is how it is," she said. "That is exactly how it is," I said, "and it changes nothing." The human embassy suite on the Pinnacle was a modest set of rooms compared to what the older species occupied. The Velocci delegation had an entire tower. The Brelikai had a wing with its own atmospheric processor, so they could breathe their homeworld air. We had 4 rooms, a communication console, and a window that looked out onto the docking ring where alien ships moved in slow, glittering procession against the black. I sat down at the console and opened the quantum link to Earth. The connection was instantaneous, which was the entire point of quantum entangled communication. No signal lag. No interception. Catherine Marsh appeared on the screen within seconds, her silver hair pulled back, her expression the controlled calm of someone who had been waiting for this call all day. "It is done," I said. "We saw," she said. "The filing registered on our end. Legal team confirms Article 9 is triggered. The quarantine is frozen. How long do we have before they find a workaround?" Catherine leaned back. "Our analysts say anywhere from 10 days to 3 weeks. Depending on how fast Drath can convene a charter review panel. He will argue that the dissolution clause was never intended to be used this way." "He would be right about that," I said. "It was not intended for this, but the language is clear." "Which is why you used it." Catherine allowed herself a thin smile. "The Defense Council is already moving. We are activating Stage 2. Stage 2, the part of this plan that kept me awake at night. The part where we had to make the galaxy believe, at least for a few weeks, that humanity could actually back up a declaration of war against 4,000 species. We could not. We all knew that. Earth had no fleet worth mentioning. We had merchant vessels, exploration ships, a few armed patrol craft near the outer colonies. Against the combined military power of the Galactic Concord, we would last approximately 2 days in a real shooting war. But a real shooting war was not the point. The point was the space between the declaration and the resolution, the negotiation window. Everything we did from this moment forward was designed to keep that window open as long as possible. "What about the merchant ships?" I asked. Catherine nodded. All 312 human-flagged vessels across Concord space have received the signal. They are going dark within the hour. Going dark meant cutting their transponders, dropping off Concord tracking grids, and dispersing into the vast empty spaces between systems. 300 ships were nothing compared to the millions that move through Concord space daily. But 300 ships that suddenly vanished, owned by a species that had just declared war, would generate exactly the kind of uncertainty we needed. And the relay network? Active as of 6 hours ago. Full coverage across the outer territories. The relay network was one of our quieter achievements. Over the past year, human engineering teams had seeded small, low-power communication satellites throughout dead zones in the outer reaches of Concord space, regions too sparse for the Concord's own communication infrastructure. On their own, each satellite was nearly invisible. Together, they formed a private communication grid that allowed our ships to coordinate without using Concord channels. No one had noticed. No one had been watching. That was the fundamental mistake every species in the Concord made about humans. They assumed that because we were young and because we were small, we were also careless. They never considered that a species from a death world, a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history being hunted by things with bigger teeth, might have learned to plan ahead. I ended the call with Catherine and sat in the dark for a while. Elena brought me coffee. Real coffee that she had brought from Earth in a sealed container, because the station's food synthesizers could not replicate the flavor properly. I held the warm cup and looked out the window at the docking ring and thought about what I had done. I had declared war on the galaxy. The words still felt unreal, like something from a story you would tell a child. But the filing was real, the legal freeze was real, and the consequences would be very, very real. Around hour 3, the galaxy started reacting. Elena had rigged a secondary terminal to monitor Concord news broadcasts, and we watched the coverage roll in from across known space. The first wave was mockery. A Brelikai entertainment host whose name translated roughly to dazzling evening spent 20 minutes analyzing my declaration and concluded that humans were either suffering from a collective neurological disorder or had simply failed to count the number of species they had declared war on. The audience, a theater full of feathered, bird-like Brelikai, trilled with laughter. An Ofari academic panel discussed human psychology and concluded that the declaration was a bluff born of desperation. One panelist compared it to a cornered animal making noise to seem larger than it was. Another suggested that the stress of interstellar diplomacy had caused me to experience a mental breakdown. I watched it all without comment. Elena muttered things under her breath that I chose not to hear. But by hour 5, the tone started to shift. The first report came from a Velocity intelligence broadcast, not entertainment media, but the kind of dry, classified briefing that someone had leaked to the press. 312 human vessels had dropped off the Concord tracking grid, all of them, simultaneously, within a 60-second window. The report noted that this level of coordination was, and I quote, inconsistent with the capabilities attributed to a pre-integration species. The second report came an hour later. A Keth Combine survey ship, mapping dead zones in the outer territories, had stumbled across one of our relay satellites. Then another, then 6 more. Within hours, Concord sensor sweeps had identified over 200 human communication devices scattered across regions of space that the Concord itself did not monitor. The broadcasts shifted from laughter to questions. How long had the humans been placing those satellites? What were the missing ships carrying? Where were they going? And then came the third thing, the one that turned questions into fear. At exactly the 8-hour mark after my declaration, an anonymous data packet was delivered simultaneously to every delegate's personal terminal in the Concord Assembly. Every single one. 4,312 packets, each one customized to its recipient species. The packets were not threats. They contained no demands, no ultimatums, no warnings. They contained something worse. Analysis. Each packet contained a detailed breakdown of the recipient species' critical infrastructure. Water supply routes for the Veloci homeworld colonies, atmospheric processor dependencies for the Brelikai nesting worlds, power grid architectures for the Ofari research stations, agricultural distribution networks for the Keth Combine trade worlds, communications relay vulnerabilities, transport choke points, medical supply chains. Every weakness, every dependency, every single point of failure. The data was accurate. We knew that because we had spent 2 years compiling it. Not through espionage in any traditional sense, not through infiltration or theft. Humans had simply been paying attention. Watching trade routes, reading public infrastructure reports, studying the engineering specifications that species openly shared during trade negotiations, never imagining that the quiet human delegation in the corner was building a map of the galaxy's soft spots. The packets carried no attribution, no signature, but every species in the Concord knew exactly who had sent them, because only one species had both the audacity and the motive. I watched the reaction on the news feeds. The mockery evaporated like water on a hot stone. In its place came something colder. Drath called an emergency session for the following morning. The announcement came through the station's public address system at what passed for midnight, and even through the mechanical translation, I could hear the strain in his voice. Elena and I sat in the quiet of the embassy and said nothing for a long time. The weight of what we had set in motion was settling over both of us. This was not a game. These were real species with real militaries, and we had just made every single one of them feel vulnerable. "Are you afraid?" Elena asked me. "Terrified," I said. "Good," she said. "Afraid people are careful. We need to be careful." She was right. We were walking a wire over a canyon, and the wire was getting thinner with every step. At around 2 in the morning, station time, there was a knock at the embassy door. Not the guards, who would have simply opened it. Someone else. Elena checked the security feed and frowned. "It is an Ofari," she said. "Junior rank, from the look of the insignia." I went to the door myself. Standing in the corridor, looking small and nervous between the 2 Velocity guards, was an Ofari attaché. The Ofari were delicate beings, slender and translucent, with skin that shifted color based on their emotional state. This one was cycling through shades of pale blue and gray, which I had learned meant anxiety. "Ambassador Hale," she said. Her voice was soft, almost musical. "My name is Seleth. I am a junior attaché to the Ofari science delegation." "I know who the Ofari are," I said. "Your delegation voted for the quarantine." Seleth flinched, her skin flashing a brief, dark violet. "Yes," she said. "We did." "Then why are you at my door?" She looked over her shoulder at the guards, then back at me. "Because not every species voted willingly, Ambassador. Some of us were told that if we did not support the resolution, our research funding from the Concord would be revoked. Our access to shared laboratories would be terminated. Our junior delegates would lose their appointments." She paused. The Velocity made it very clear what would happen to those who dissented. I stepped aside and let her in. We sat in the embassy's small conference room. Elena, Seleth, and I, and the Ofari attaché told me what I had suspected for 3 years. The quarantine had not been a spontaneous response to human development. It had been orchestrated by Drath and the Velocity hegemony for at least a year, with smaller species pressured, bribed, or threatened into compliance. The vote was unanimous, because Drath had made unanimity the only safe option. "How many species were coerced?" I asked. "I do not know exactly," Seleth said. "But among the delegations I have contact with, at least 40 were pressured directly, perhaps more who did not speak of it. 40 species who had voted against their own judgment because the Velocity had made them afraid. 40 species who might, under different circumstances, have stood with us." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Seleth's skin settled into a steady, pale green. Determination. If I remembered my Ofari color charts correctly. "Because what you did today, your declaration, it was reckless and dangerous, and possibly insane," she said. "But it was also the first time in decades that anyone has publicly challenged the Velocity's control of this body. There are species in this Concord who have been waiting for someone to do that." She leaned forward. "What do the humans actually want, Ambassador?" I looked at her for a long moment. This could be a trap. She could be reporting to Drath. Every instinct I had developed as a negotiator told me to be cautious. But another instinct, a deeper one, the one that had made me choose diplomacy in the first place, told me that this frightened young Ofari who had crossed a guarded corridor in the middle of the night to knock on my door was telling the truth. We want a seat at the table, I said. A real one. Not a provisional chair in the corner, where we can be ignored. We want what every species in this Concord deserves, a voice that matters. Selith held my gaze with her large, luminous eyes. Then you should know, she said, that you are not the only ones who feel that way. She left before dawn. The guards watched her go and said nothing. Whether they would report her visit, I did not know. I stood at the window and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, 300 human ships were running silent through the dark, and a planet of 8 billion people was holding its breath. We had bought ourselves time, not much, but enough to take the next step. And the next step was going to make the declaration of war look gentle by comparison. The emergency session convened at what the Concorde called First Light, the moment when the Pinnacle Station's orbit brought it around the local star, and sunlight flooded the chamber through the enormous crystal dome overhead. It was designed to be dramatic, and it was. Golden light poured down over 4,000 delegations, casting long shadows across the stone floor and making the whole chamber look like the inside of a cathedral. I walked in under armed escort, 6 Velocii enforcers in full-powered armor, each one a head taller than me, their faces hidden behind featureless black visors. They flanked me 3 on each side, and their boots struck the floor in perfect unison, each step echoing through the chamber like a drumbeat. The message was clear. Look at your prisoner. Look at the small, fragile creature we have contained. I walked in smiling. The chamber was full. Not just delegates, but observers, journalists, diplomatic staff from hundreds of worlds. Floating camera drones from at least 50 different media networks hovered near the ceiling, their lenses tracking my every step. The gallery seats, normally half empty, were packed. Word had spread. The Death World species had declared war on the galaxy, and everyone wanted to see what happened next. Drath was already at the High Arbiter's platform, standing tall in his violet robes, his amber eyes fixed on me as I took my position at the respondents' podium. He looked tired. I doubted he had slept. Good. This emergency session is convened to address the unprecedented and destabilizing action taken by the human delegation, Drath began. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge to it that had not been there before. Ambassador Hale, you have 24 hours to formally rescind your declaration of war and accept the terms of Resolution 7701. Failure to do so will be interpreted as an act of aggression against the Concorde and will be met with appropriate response. 24 hours. An ultimatum. Drath was trying to compress the timeline, to close the window I had opened before I could use it. I leaned into the podium microphone. I will not be rescinding the declaration, High Arbiter. The murmur that rippled through the chamber was quieter than yesterday's explosion. The shock had faded. Now there was something harder underneath it. Anticipation. Under the Concorde founding charter, I continued, the only mechanism for ending a formal state of war without a full treaty is the concession of terms. Article 9, Section 17. The declaring party presents terms. The responding party accepts, rejects, or negotiates. That is the process. I projected the relevant charter text onto the central display again. I wanted everyone to see the words. I have terms, I said, and I would like to present them now. Drath's jaw tightened. He could refuse to hear them, but doing so in front of 50 media networks would make the Velocii look like tyrants afraid of words. He knew that, I knew that, the entire chamber knew that. Proceed, he said. I opened the folder I had brought with me, not a data pad, a physical folder, paper and ink. I had chosen the format deliberately. There was something about a human holding a piece of paper that made other species uneasy. It reminded them that we came from a world where information was carved into stone and scratched onto animal skin, and we had still managed to reach the stars. Term 1, I said. Full and permanent voting membership for the human species in the Galactic Concorde. No provisional status, no observation period. Full membership with all associated rights, effective immediately. I paused to let the translation grid carry it through the chamber. Term 2. The complete abolition of the provisional species classification from the Concorde Charter. This category has been used to suppress the rights of 17 newly contacted species over the past century. It is a tool of control, not of integration. and it has no place in a body that claims to represent galactic civilization. I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the upper tiers. The Keth Combine delegation. The Provisional Species Clause had been used against 3 of their member worlds. Term 3. An independent review of the quarantine provision, Resolution 7701, conducted by a panel that includes legal scholars from Earth and from at least 10 non-Velocity species. The review will examine whether the resolution was enacted through legitimate consensus or through coercion. Drath's hands tightened on the edge of his platform. Coercion. I had said the word out loud, in front of the entire Concord, and now it was in the record. Term 4, I said. A formal apology from the Concord Assembly to the human species, entered into the permanent record, acknowledging that the quarantine was enacted without adequate justification and in violation of the principles of sovereign equality upon which this body was founded. I closed the folder. These are our terms. They are not demands for territory. They are not demands for power. They are demands for fairness, and they are non-negotiable. Silence held the chamber for a long moment. Then Drath spoke, and his voice was colder than I had ever heard it. You stand in this chamber under armed guard, representing a species that possesses no meaningful military capability, and you present non-negotiable terms. He shook his head slowly. Ambassador, you are either delusional or suicidal. Neither, I said. I am a negotiator, and the first rule of negotiation is that you never enter a room without leverage. What leverage? Drath snapped. You have nothing. You are one world against thousands. You are right, I said. We are one world, but we have not been idle on that one world, High Arbiter, and we have not been idle in your galaxy either. I tapped my podium screen and brought up a new display. A star map. It showed 14 points of light scattered across the outer territories of Concord space, each one marked with a small blue indicator. Over the past 72 hours, I said, 312 human merchant vessels dropped off your tracking grid. You know this. Your intelligence services have been searching for them. I am going to tell you where they went. The chamber leaned forward. I could feel it, 4,000 species collectively holding their breath. They went to 14 colony worlds belonging to minor Concord member species, worlds that have been neglected, underfunded, and overtaxed by this body for decades. Worlds whose populations have been struggling with food shortages, medical supply deficits, and failing atmospheric systems. I changed the display. Each of the 14 points expanded into a data summary, showing cargo manifests, delivery records, and confirmation receipts signed by local authorities. Our ships delivered food, medicine, atmospheric stabilizers, water purification equipment, emergency power cells, all of it purchased with human credits, loaded in human cargo bays, and delivered by human crews, who volunteered knowing that they were operating in the territory of species that had just voted to cage their homeworld. The silence was deafening. We did not deliver weapons, I said. We did not deliver soldiers. We delivered help, because that is what humans do. When we see people suffering, we do not file a resolution about it. We load a ship, and we go. I looked up at the tiers. I found the Keth Combine delegation, a cluster of small, furred beings from a dozen different worlds. Their senior delegate, a Cathari named Vor, was staring at me with wide, dark eyes. 3 of those 14 worlds are Keth Combine members, I said. Colony Vortessen received 12 tons of grain and 6 atmospheric stabilizers. Colony Draneth received a full medical supply package, including surgical equipment, your own Concord Medical Corps, classified as non-priority 3 years ago. Colony Pelham received emergency water purification units after their treatment plant failed 8 months ago, and their request for Concord assistance was denied. I turned back to Drath. Denied, High Arbiter. 8 months. An entire colony drinking contaminated water for 8 months, because this Concord decided they were not a priority. And when we showed up with clean water and working filters, do you know what they said to us? Drath said nothing. They said thank you, and then they asked why it took so long. The chamber erupted, not in panic this time, but in something rawer, voices overlapping, delegates turning to each other, accusations flying between platforms. I saw the Brelikai delegation arguing among themselves. I saw the Ofari gesturing urgently, and I saw, slowly, like a tide turning, smaller delegations beginning to nod. Within the hour, the first defections came. The 14 species whose colonies we had aided publicly announced that they would not support any military action against Earth. Their delegates stood, one by one, on their platforms, and stated for the record that they could not in good conscience participate in the quarantine of a species that had shown them more compassion in 72 hours than the Concord had shown them in decades. The Keth Combine followed. Delegate Vor stood on his platform, his small frame barely visible above the railing, and spoke in a voice that shook with something between anger and grief. "We joined this Concord because we were promised protection," Vor said. "We were promised that the strong would defend the weak, that no species would be left behind. Those promises were broken. Not by the humans, by us, by this body. And if the only species willing to keep those promises is the one we just voted to imprison, then perhaps we are the ones who should be ashamed." 200 species broke from the quarantine coalition that day. Out of 4,000, it was a small number, less than 5%. But it was enough to shatter the most important weapon Drath had, the illusion that the entire galaxy stood united against humanity. Drath called a recess. He had no choice. The session was spiraling out of his control, and he needed time to regroup. During the recess, Elena and I were approached by delegates from a dozen minor species. They came to the side chamber where we had been directed to wait, slipping past the guards one or two at a time, some of them glancing over their shoulders as if they expected to be caught. They were afraid. That was the first thing I noticed. These were not bold rebels making a principled stand. These were frightened people who had lived under the Velocity shadow for generations and had never dared to step out of it. A Palumi delegate, a squat, rock-skinned being named Granth, told me that the Velocity had threatened to cut trade access to his species' homeworld if they voted against the quarantine. An Isari representative, a willowy, four-armed figure named Lissara, said that 3 Isari research stations had been moved to the bottom of the Concord's maintenance queue after the Isari delegation had questioned a Veloci trade proposal the previous year. I listened to every story, I took notes, and when they asked me what I planned to do, I told them the truth. "I cannot protect you," I said. "Humanity does not have the military strength to shield any of you from the Velocity. If they choose to punish you for standing with us, I cannot stop them." The room went still. "But I can promise you this," I said. "If they come after you, the galaxy will know about it. Every act of retaliation, every threat, every trade restriction, we will document it and broadcast it to every species in the Concord. The Velocity rule through silence. They rule because no one talks about what they do in the dark. We are going to turn on the lights." Granth looked at me with his small, deep-set eyes. "That is not much of a shield, Ambassador." "No," I said. "It is not, but it is what we have. And I have learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe is simply the truth, spoken loudly enough that no one can pretend they did not hear it." Selith was there too, standing near the back of the room. She had not spoken during the meeting, but as the other delegates filed out, she approached me. "You are building a coalition," she said. "I am trying. Against the Velocity. Against anyone who thinks they have the right to decide which species matter and which ones do not." Selith's skin shifted to a deep, steady blue. Thoughtfulness, I had learned. The color of careful consideration. "There are more who would join you," she said. "Not openly. Not yet. But the data packets you sent, the vulnerability analyses, they frightened people. And frightened people will do one of two things. They will fight you, or they will join you. Right now, most of them are trying to decide which option is safer." "And what about you?" I asked. "Which option are you choosing?" She looked at me for a long time. "I am choosing the one that does not require me to be afraid anymore," she said. After she left, Elena and I sat alone in the quiet room. The station hummed around us, the vast machinery of a galactic civilization grinding forward, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint chime of the recess ending. 200 species, Elena said. "It is a start." "It is more than a start," I said. "It is a crack in the wall, and cracks spread." I stood up and straightened my jacket. In a few minutes, I would walk back into the chamber and face Drath again. He would threaten, he would bluster, he would try to reassert control. But the ground had shifted. Not enough, not yet, but enough that I could feel it moving under my feet, the slow, tectonic grind of a galaxy, beginning to question the order it had accepted for centuries. We were not winning, not even close. But for the first time since I had set foot on this station 3 years ago, we were not losing either. And in this game, not losing was the same as moving forward. I walked back into the chamber. 3 days after I declared war on 4,000 species, the Velocity stopped pretending. The emergency session had ground into a stalemate. Drath spent hours at the podium arguing that my declaration was a procedural abuse, that Article 9 was never intended to shield an aggressive species from legitimate collective action. He was right, technically. The architects of the Charter had probably never imagined a scenario where one civilization would declare war on the entire Concord just to freeze a resolution. But the language was the language, and language does not care about intent. It cares about precision. Our legal team back on Earth had been very, very precise. But Drath was not a man who accepted defeat through procedure. He was Velocity. His species had dominated this Concord for 600 years, and they had not done it by following rules they could not bend. On the third morning, station time, I was standing at the embassy window drinking coffee when Elena walked in with her face the color of chalk. "The Veloci Third Fleet just entered faster than light transit," she said. "Heading for Sol, 400 warships. They will arrive in approximately 19 hours. I set the coffee down carefully because my hands had started to shake. "Under whose authority?" I asked. "Drath issued the order 90 minutes ago, but not through the Concord. He invoked Veloci's sovereign military jurisdiction. He is framing it as an independent Veloci action, not a Concord operation." I understood immediately. The Concord quarantine was frozen by my declaration, but Drath had found his workaround. He was not sending the Concord fleet. He was sending the Veloci fleet, under Veloci authority, as a sovereign military deployment. Technically, it had nothing to do with the Concord at all. It was brilliant. It was also the most dangerous thing he could have done, because it stripped away the pretense that this had ever been about galactic safety. This was the Veloci hegemony sending its warships to surround a planet that had dared to challenge their authority. Nothing more, nothing less. "Get me a channel to Catherine," I said. Catherine Marsh appeared on the screen within a minute. She already knew. "We have been tracking the fleet since it mobilized," she said. 406 warships, 12 dreadnoughts, 94 heavy cruisers, 220 destroyers, 80 support vessels. Fleet Admiral Korath commanding." "Korath," I said. The name was familiar. He was one of the Veloci military's most decorated commanders. Not a politician in uniform, a real soldier. "He is considered pragmatic," Catherine said, reading my thoughts. "Our analysts believe he will assess the tactical situation before engaging, but he will engage if ordered to. What do we have?" Catherine's expression shifted. Something that was not quite a smile crossed her face. "Stage 3, she said. Stage 3, the part of the plan I had not been briefed on in detail because there were things that were safer not to know when you were sitting in the heart of enemy territory. But I knew the broad strokes. Humanity had not been building warships. We did not have the industrial capacity or the time to construct a fleet that could match the Veloci in conventional combat. Even if we had, it would have taken decades. We had years. So we built something else. "The defense grid is active," Catherine said. "Full deployment. Commander Leo Grant is running the operation from the Lunar Command Center." She began showing me the layout, and for the first time, I saw the full scope of what Earth had been building in secret for the past 5 years. The Sol defense grid was not a fleet. It was not a battle line or a formation, or anything the Veloci would recognize as a military force. It was a system, the entire solar system, converted into a fortress. Thousands of autonomous defense platforms were positioned throughout the asteroid belt, tiny, hard to detect, and armed with railgun batteries capable of accelerating projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed. Drone carriers were hidden in the upper atmospheres of Jupiter and Saturn, their hulls coated with materials that absorbed sensor scans. Electronic warfare nodes were scattered across the orbits of every planet, ready to flood hostile communications with noise. There was no flagship, no command ship, no single target that the Velocity could destroy to end the fight. Just a web of silent, waiting weapons spread across billions of kilometers of space, all linked by the same quantum communication network that connected our relay satellites in the outer territories. The idea, Catherine said, is that you do not need to beat a fleet if you can make the cost of victory higher than any rational commander would accept. And what is the cost? I asked. Our simulations say they can take Sol, but it would cost them between 60 and 70% of their fleet. Korath would limp home with maybe 150 ships out of 400. 60 to 70% losses. In any military context, that was not a victory. That was a catastrophe. And the Velocity would know it the moment they scanned the system and saw what was waiting for them. But there was a problem, and Catherine and I both knew it. If Korath was under direct orders from Drath, he might not have the option to be rational. Pride and politics could push him into an engagement that cold mathematics said he should avoid. I need to buy more time, I said. If I can keep the pressure on from this end, make Drath's position untenable here on the station, Korath might not receive the order to fire. Then I suggest you move quickly, Catherine said. You have 19 hours. I ended the call and turned to Elena. I need to broadcast, I said. Not to the Concorde. To everyone. Every species. Every world. Every news network. Can you get me an open channel? Elena's fingers were already moving across her terminal. The Velocity will try to block it. They will try. But our relay network covers the outer territories, and I know for a fact that at least 30 Concorde media outlets have been monitoring our embassy communications since the declaration. They are already listening. I just need to give them something worth hearing. 20 minutes later, I was standing in the embassy conference room, looking into a camera drone that Elena had positioned at eye level. The broadcast would go out on every frequency we could access: Concorde channels, our own relay network, and the pirated media feeds that several sympathetic delegations had quietly opened for us. I did not write a speech. I did not have time. I spoke from the gut, and I spoke plainly. My name is Dominic Hale. I am the human ambassador to the Galactic Concorde. 3 days ago, I declared war on every species in this body. Today, I want to tell you why. I took a breath. I did not declare war because humanity wants to fight. We do not. We are 8 billion people on one small world, and we know exactly how outmatched we are. I declared war because it was the only way to make this Concorde listen. I looked directly into the lens. Right now, as I speak to you, 400 Velocity warships are heading toward my homeworld. They were not sent by the Concorde. They were sent by High Arbiter Drath, using Velocity military authority, because the Concorde's own laws prevented him from enforcing a quarantine that he orchestrated through threats and coercion. I let that sentence sit. This is not about humanity. This is about every species in this Concorde that has ever been told to sit down and be quiet. Every species that has been denied resources, denied representation, denied a voice, because the Velocity decided they were not important enough. The quarantine was never about protecting the galaxy from humans. It was about protecting the Velocity from a galaxy that might start asking questions. I leaned forward. I am asking those questions now, and I am asking every species watching this broadcast to ask them with me. Not with weapons, not with violence, but with the one thing that the Velocity fear more than any warship: the truth. I ended the broadcast. Elena was staring at me. That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen, she said, or the most foolish. Probably both, I said. The broadcast hit the Concorde like a shockwave. Within hours, the number of species that had broken from the quarantine coalition nearly doubled. 312 worlds now stood openly against the Velocity position. More importantly, the Keth Combine, which had been quietly supportive, but publicly neutral, made a formal announcement. They were withdrawing from the Galactic Concorde entirely. The withdrawal of the Keth Combine was the first in 600 years of Concorde history. It was a small faction, 40 species, most of them minor worlds with limited military or economic power. but the symbolism was enormous. If the Keth could leave, anyone could leave. And suddenly, every species in the Concord was doing the same calculation. If this body cannot protect us from the Veloci, and if the humans are willing to stand against them, then what exactly are we getting from our membership? 11 more species withdrew within the day, then 20, then 30. The Concord was bleeding members, and every departure made the body weaker and the remaining members more nervous. Meanwhile, at Sol, 19 hours became 12, then 6, then 0. The Veloci Third Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. 406 warships, arranged in a standard Veloci battle formation, their sensors sweeping the void ahead of them. I was not there. I was 7,000 light-years away on the pinnacle, watching a data feed that Catherine had routed through our quantum link. But Commander Leo Grant was there, sitting in a command chair carved into the rock of the moon, surrounded by screens that showed him every ship, every platform, every drone in the solar system. He let the Veloci scan. He wanted them to see. Fleet Admiral Korath saw it. His tactical AI, one of the most sophisticated combat prediction systems in the galaxy, processed the data and delivered its assessment. I learned later what that assessment said, because Korath told me himself, months afterward. The AI calculated that taking the Sol system was achievable. It also calculated that doing so would result in the destruction of between 240 and 280 Veloci warships, up to 70% of his fleet. The surviving ships would sustain heavy damage. The engagement would take weeks, not hours, because the human defenses were decentralized and could not be eliminated by any single strike. Korath was a soldier. He understood numbers, and he understood what those numbers meant in the broader context of a Concord that was fracturing, a galaxy that was watching, and a hegemony that could not afford to appear weak. He held position. His fleet sat at the edge of Sol and waited. I opened a direct channel to his flagship. It took several minutes for the connection to establish through the relay network, but eventually, his face appeared on my screen. He was younger than I expected, for a Veloci. Sharp features, hard eyes, the bearing of a man who had spent his life making difficult decisions. Admiral Korath, I said. My name is Dominic Hale. I know who you are, Ambassador, he said. His voice was flat, professional. You have seen our defenses. I have. Then you know what it will cost you to take our world. I know what my tactical AI projects, he said carefully. I leaned forward. I did not threaten. I did not boast. Boasting was for people who had something to prove. I was talking to a man who held the lives of 8 billion people in his hands, and I needed him to think, not react. Admiral, you can take our world. Your fleet is powerful enough, but you will burn for it, and the galaxy will watch you burn. And when you limp home with what is left, those 300 species who just defied your arbiter will know that the Veloci can bleed. Is that the lesson you want to teach them? Korath said nothing for a long time. His amber eyes studied me through the screen. What would you have me do, Ambassador? He asked. Hold your position, I said. Do not advance. Do not withdraw. Give me time. Time for what? Time to end this without anyone dying. Another silence. Then Korath nodded, once, slowly. You have 24 hours, Ambassador. After that, I follow my orders. The channel closed. I sat back and closed my eyes. 24 hours. One day to end a war I had started, to save a world I could not reach, and to bring down a political order that had ruled the galaxy for 6 centuries. Elena put her hand on my shoulder. You can do this, she said. I opened my eyes. We can do this, I said. Get me Seleth. Get me Delegate Vor. Get me every sympathetic delegate who will answer a call. It was time to end this, one way or another. I did not sleep that night. There was no time and there was no point. Sleep requires a mind at rest, and mine was running calculations that had no end, playing scenarios that branched and split and collapsed into uncertainty. Elena worked through the night beside me, coordinating with delegates across the station through back channels that Seleth had helped us establish. The Ofari attaché had proven more resourceful than her junior rank suggested. She knew people. She knew which delegates were genuinely sympathetic and which were simply hedging their bets. She knew who could be trusted with information and who would run straight to Drath. By morning, we had assembled a coalition of 419 species. Some had formally withdrawn from the Concord. Others were still technically members, but had made public statements opposing the Veloci fleet deployment. Still others were working quietly behind the scenes, unwilling to go public, but willing to vote against Drath if it came to a floor decision. 419 out of 4,312, still a minority, still not enough to overturn a resolution through standard procedure. But I was not planning to use standard procedure. The assembly session convened at first light, as always. The golden sunlight poured through the crystal dome, and the chamber filled with delegates who looked like they had slept about as well as I had. Tension hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew about the fleet, everyone knew about the standoff, and everyone knew that somewhere in the next few hours, something was going to break. Drath took his platform. He looked thinner than he had 3 days ago, the lines of his face sharper, his amber eyes sunken. The fracturing of his coalition had hurt him, but he was not finished. Men like Drath were never finished until they were removed. He called the session to order, and then he did something I had not expected. "Delegates," Drath said, his voice carrying through the chamber with practiced authority. "The events of the past 3 days have demonstrated that the Galactic Concord faces a threat of unprecedented nature. Not merely from the human species, but from the instability their actions have introduced into our collective order." He paused. His eyes swept the chamber. "The withdrawal of member species from this body is an act of civilizational vandalism. It undermines the unity that has maintained galactic peace for 6 centuries. And it has been engineered by a single species that has exploited our laws, manipulated our weaker members, and turned our own principles against us." I watched him from the respondents' podium and felt something cold settle in my chest. I knew that tone. I had heard it before, in history recordings from Earth, in speeches given by men who had decided that the rules no longer served them. "Therefore," Drath said, "I invoke the right of supremacy, as granted to the High Arbiter under the original Concord Charter. In times of existential threat to galactic civilization, the High Arbiter is empowered to issue binding military and political directives without the approval of the full assembly." The chamber erupted. Not in the confused panic of my declaration 3 days ago, but in genuine outrage. Delegates rose from their seats. Voices crashed against each other in a dozen languages. The translation grid struggled to keep up. The right of supremacy. I had read about it during my preparation for this assignment, buried deep in the original charter documents, written 1,200 years ago during a period when the Concord was a small coalition facing external threats that demanded rapid, unified response. It gave the High Arbiter essentially dictatorial power during a declared emergency. It had been used twice in Concord history, both times during genuine existential crises. Both times, it had been controversial, and both times, it had been relinquished voluntarily after the crisis passed. No one had invoked it in over 1,000 years. It was considered a relic, a historical curiosity that existed in the Charter, the way old emergency powers exist in the constitutions of Earth nations. Technically valid, but politically unthinkable. Until now. "I declare the human species an existential threat to galactic civilization," Drath said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Under the right of supremacy, I order the Veloci Third Fleet to proceed with the pacification of the Sol system. I further order all Concord member species to cease communication with the human delegation and to withdraw any support, material or diplomatic, from the human cause." He looked directly at me. "Ambassador Hale, your terms are rejected, your declaration of war is noted, and your species will learn what it means to challenge the order that has kept this galaxy in peace for 600 years. Silence fell, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, when the air itself seems stunned. I looked around the chamber. I saw fear on the faces of our allies. I saw grim satisfaction on the faces of Drath's loyalists. And I saw, on the faces of hundreds of other delegates, something I had not expected. Anger. Not at me, at Drath. The right of supremacy was not just a political tool. It was a symbol. It represented everything that the smaller species of the Concord feared most. The idea that one individual, backed by one dominant species, could override the collective will of thousands. By invoking it, Drath had not just threatened humanity, he had threatened every species in the chamber. If he could do it to us, he could do it to anyone, and every delegate in the room understood that. I stepped to the podium. The guards shifted behind me, but they did not stop me. Perhaps they were waiting for orders. Perhaps they simply did not know what to do. "High Arbiter," I said. My voice was steady. I made it steady. "You have just invoked a power that has not been used in 1200 years. A power that gives you the authority to bypass every delegate in this chamber, to silence every voice, to command every fleet." I looked up at the tiers. "I am not going to argue the legality of the right of supremacy. It is in the charter. The language is clear. High Arbiter Drath has the technical authority to do what he has just done." I paused. "But I am going to ask every species in this chamber a question. Not as the human ambassador, not as a diplomat, as a person, speaking to other people." I took a breath. "Is this what you built the Concord for?" The question hung in the air. 600 years ago, your ancestors came together because they believed that no single species should have the power to dictate the fate of the galaxy. They created this body because they had seen what happened when the powerful acted alone, when decisions were made in dark rooms by a few and imposed on the many. They wrote a charter that was supposed to guarantee that every voice mattered, that every species, no matter how small or how new, had a seat at this table. I gestured toward Drath. "And now one man stands at that podium and tells you that none of that matters, that your votes do not matter, that your voices do not matter, that he alone will decide the fate of my world, and by extension, the fate of yours." I could feel the chamber shifting, not physically, emotionally. Something was moving through the room, passing from delegate to delegate like a current. "I have been your colleague for 3 years," I said. "In that time, most of you never spoke to me. Most of you never acknowledged that I existed, and I understand why. We are young. We are strange. We come from a world that most of you consider a nightmare. A planet where the ground shakes and the sky throws lightning, and the creatures have been trying to eat each other for 4 billion years." A faint, nervous ripple of amusement passed through parts of the chamber. "But that world made us who we are. It taught us to survive. It taught us to adapt. It taught us to build, and to rebuild again, after everything we built was knocked down. We have survived ice ages, and plagues, and wars that nearly destroyed us. We have looked into the abyss of our own extinction, and climbed back out, every single time, because that is what humans do." I looked at Drath. He was watching me with an expression I could not read. "You were so afraid of what we might become that you never stopped to ask what we already are. We are the species that runs into burning buildings to save strangers. We are the species that crossed oceans in wooden boats, because we needed to know what was on the other side. We are the species that looked up at your stars, and did not feel fear. We felt wonder, and you wanted to lock us in a cage for that." I turned back to the chamber. "High Arbiter Drath says we are an existential threat. He is wrong. We are not a threat to galactic civilization. We are an invitation to build something better than what you have. Something that does not run on fear and coercion, and the quiet threat of punishment. Something that runs on the principle that every species, from the mightiest to the smallest, deserves a voice." I paused. "But that choice is not mine to make. It is yours. Every one of you. You can sit in your seats and let one man decide the future of this galaxy. Or you can stand up and decide it for yourselves." I stepped back from the podium. For a moment, nothing happened. The chamber was still. 4,000 species, millions of years of combined history, trillions of lives represented, all balanced on the edge of a decision. Then Delegate Vor of the Keth Combine stood on his platform. His small, furred body was barely visible above the railing, but his voice carried clearly through the translation grid. "The Keth Combine moves to censure High Arbiter Drath, and to strip the right of supremacy from the Concord Charter permanently." A second voice joined, then a third, then a dozen, then 100. They stood one by one, delegates from species I had never spoken to, species whose names I could not pronounce, species from worlds I would never visit. They stood because the right of supremacy was not just a threat to humanity, it was a threat to the idea that their voices mattered. The vote was called. Not by Drath, who stood frozen on his platform, but by the Chamber's automated procedural system, which recognized a motion with sufficient support and initiated the voting protocol. The count was not close. 2,907 votes to censure Drath and abolish the right of supremacy. 843 opposed. The rest abstained. Drath was removed as High Arbiter, not arrested, not dragged away. He simply stood on his platform as the result flashed across the central display, and then he walked down the steps and disappeared through a side exit without saying a word. I watched him go and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just exhaustion, and the numb awareness that we were not done yet. A Veloci senator named Cauldron, one of the moderates who had been quietly opposing Drath from within his own delegation, assumed temporary authority over the Concord Assembly. I had spoken with Cauldron twice during the recess on the previous day. She was cautious, measured, and deeply concerned about the damage Drath's actions had done to the Veloci reputation. She opened formal negotiations within the hour. The terms I had presented 3 days earlier formed the basis of the discussion: full voting membership for humanity, abolition of the provisional species classification, an independent review of the quarantine resolution, a formal apology. Cauldron accepted the first 3 terms with minimal modification. The fourth, the apology, required several hours of negotiation, not because anyone disputed that it was warranted, but because the language had to be precise enough to satisfy humanity without humiliating the Veloci beyond what their political structure could absorb. In the end, the apology was entered into the permanent record. It acknowledged that Resolution 7701 had been enacted without sufficient justification and through procedural manipulation that was inconsistent with the Concord's founding principles. It was not everything I had wanted, but it was enough. An additional provision was added to the agreement, one I had not originally proposed, but that emerged organically from the coalition of minor species that had formed during the crisis. The creation of a Concord Reform Commission, a permanent body tasked with reviewing and addressing systemic inequities within the Concord's governance structure. The commission would be co-chaired by a human representative and a Keth Combine representative. The Keth Combine, upon hearing this proposal, reversed its withdrawal from the Concord. So did most of the other species that had left. They had made their point. Now there was a structure in place to address the grievances that had driven them away. At Sol, Fleet Admiral Korath received new orders, not from Drath, who no longer had the authority to issue them, from the Veloci Senate, which had convened an emergency session and voted to recall the Third Fleet. 406 warships powered down their weapons, disengaged from battle formation, and entered faster-than-light transit heading home. Commander Leo Grant watched them go from his lunar command center and, according to Elena, who spoke with him later, said a single word that the recording systems captured for posterity. Good. The formal treaty ending the state of war between humanity and the Galactic Concord was signed 3 days later. It was a brief document, as treaties go. The war had lasted 6 days, no shots had been fired, no lives had been lost. On the day the treaty was signed, I received a private message from Korath. It was short. Your species is terrifying, Ambassador, not because you fight, because you think. I hope we never face each other across a battlefield again, and I hope, for all our sakes, that the galaxy you are building is better than the one you just dismantled. I stood at the embassy window that evening, looking out at the docking ring. Ships were arriving from dozens of worlds, delegates and advisors and observers coming for the first session of the Reform Commission. It was going to be messy. It was going to be slow. It was going to be frustrating and imperfect and full of compromises that satisfied no one completely. But it was going to happen, because 400 species had stood up and said that the old way was not good enough, because a handful of frightened delegates had knocked on an embassy door in the middle of the night, because a small, furred delegate named Vor had found the courage to speak the truth from a platform where his head barely cleared the railing. Seleth appeared beside me at the window. She had been appointed the Ofari representative to the Reform Commission. Her skin was a soft, steady gold. a color I had not seen on her before. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired. You should sleep." "Soon." She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for someone to ask since the moment I stood at that podium 6 days ago. "Would you really have gone to war with the entire galaxy?" I looked at her. Her large, luminous eyes reflected the stars outside the window, and I thought about all the things I could say, about strategy and legal clauses and calculated risks, about the defense grid and the relay network and the data packets, about the plans and the contingencies and the sleepless nights. But that was not the answer she was looking for, and it was not the truth. "No," I said, "I would not have gone to war with the galaxy, because the galaxy is not the enemy. The galaxy is just a collection of species trying to find their way, same as us. Some of them are afraid. Some of them are cruel. Most of them are just trying to survive." I looked back at the stars. I declared war on the idea that the galaxy belonged to anyone. On the idea that the powerful get to decide who matters. On the idea that a species can be locked away because someone with a bigger fleet decided they were too dangerous to be free. I turned to her. And I would do it again, because that is what humans do. We do not accept cages, we do not accept silence, and we do not accept a universe where the strong can crush the weak just because they have the power to do it. Seleth's skin shifted to that deep, steady blue again. Thoughtfulness, consideration, and something else underneath it. Something warmer that I did not have a color chart for. "You are a strange species," she said. I have heard that before. I did not say it was a bad thing. She left to prepare for the commission meeting. I stayed at the window. Outside, the stars burned in the dark, billions of them, each one a sun. Each sun perhaps warming a world. Each world perhaps home to a species that was looking up at the same sky and wondering if they were alone. They were not alone, none of them were. And if I had done my job right, if the coalition held and the commission worked, and the slow, grinding work of reform actually produced change, then maybe someday, no species in this galaxy would ever have to feel alone again. I finished my coffee. It had gone cold. Then I turned away from the window, straightened my tie, and went to work. There was a galaxy to rebuild, and the first meeting started in 20 minutes. The stars could wait. They were patient. And so, when it mattered, were we.